Colonel David Hackworth is standing ankle-deep in a Vietnamese construction cut, where the earth has been peeled back like a scab. A bulldozer operator is shouting and waving him over, half excited, half spooked. The blade has scraped something pale out of the clay. At first, it looks like driftwood, then the shape resolves into a rib cage, a Viet Cong soldier. Buried so long the jungle has tried to reclaim him. 6 months, maybe a year. Long enough for uniform cloth to rot into threads, long enough for bones to bleach and blacken and stain. And in the crook of those skeletal arms is a rifle. An AK-47, rust-smudged, muddy, still clutched like the dead man's last argument. Hackworth crouches. He doesn't flinch the way the younger guys do. He pries the weapon free with a calm, practiced tug, like he's pulling a shovel out of wet ground. Mud strings off the receiver. Grit crunches in the seams. Someone laughs nervously. Someone else mutters a prayer. Hackworth works the charging handle. It moves. He rocks the magazine out and back in, checks the feed lips. 30 rounds still sitting there, bright and oily like they've been waiting for orders. He looks over his shoulder at the men watching. The look in his eyes says, "You're not going to like what I'm about to show you. Watch this," he says. This is how a real infantry rifle behaves. He shoulders it, takes a half step into a clear patch, and squeezes the trigger. The AK barks like it's insulted to have been doubted. It spits fire in a clean, uninterrupted string. The bolt slams back and forth with that heavy mechanical certainty. No hesitation, no coughing, no stutter. 30 rounds leave the barrel like they were born to. When the last casing spins into the dirt, Hackworth lowers the rifle and lets the smoke drift up through the heat. Buried in Vietnamese mud for a year, and it still ran like it had been cleaned that morning. That moment, one officer in a construction zone holding the enemy's rifle like proof in a courtroom, wasn't just a cool story. It was a diagnosis. Because Hackworth wasn't impressed by Soviet engineering, he was furious at American failure. "This," he said, tapping the AK like it was a witness, "is what our boys needed, and this is what they deserved. Not what Washington sent them. Not the sleek black rifle that looked like the future and jammed like a curse. This is the story of the most bitter small-arms scandal in modern American war. The story of how men in air-conditioned offices shipped a rifle into a jungle without making sure it could survive the jungle, and how young Americans learned, sometimes with their last breath in their throat, that the enemy's gun was the one you could trust. Because in the summer of 1967, Marines weren't just dying, they were being found. Bodies in elephant grass, bodies in tree lines, bodies near rice paddy berms, hands locked tight around rifles that had been taken apart in desperation. Bolt carriers pulled out, charging handles yanked, cleaning rods bent, fingers black with carbon and blood, not because they quit fighting, because their weapons quit. Picture it. You're 19, maybe 20. You're in a tree line near the Cambodian border where the jungle presses in so close it feels like it's listening. The air is so thick you can taste it, hot, wet, metallic. 100 degrees and 100% humidity, and you haven't been properly dry in 3 weeks. Your socks are permanently soaked, your boots smell like rot. Your skin has that constant irritated burn of sweat and mildew. You see muzzle flashes, brief little cameras of light in the leaves. You shoulder your rifle, center the blur where the flashes are coming from, and pull the trigger. Not a bang, a click, a hollow metallic tick that sounds like a door latching when it should have been a thunderclap. That sound, the wrong sound, was the last thing hundreds of Americans heard. Because while you're frantically trying to clear a jam with shaking hands, the man across from you is firing an AK that doesn't care about mud, doesn't care about humidity, doesn't care about your panic. His rifle is singing and it doesn't stop. The rifle that was supposed to save American lives was the M16. It looked like science fiction had been issued as standard equipment. Black synthetic furniture, aluminum, clean angles, a sharp silhouette that made the old M14 look like a relic from another century. Compared to the heavy wood and steel rifles Marines grew up admiring, the M16 felt almost unreal, light, fast. Space age. Defense Secretary Robert McNamara personally pushed it. This was going to be the future. The rifle that would modernize the infantry, the rifle that would win Vietnam, and then it arrived in the jungle and began failing like a bad promise. It didn't fail politely either, it failed catastrophically, in the middle of contact, in the moment when there is no later, no, we'll fix it after the fight. The heart of the early M16's trouble was a design choice that was elegant on paper and punishing in reality. The system that vented hot propellant gas back into the action. Every shot pumped heat and grime into the bolt carrier group. Every shot left carbon like soot in a chimney. Fire enough rounds and you weren't just shooting, you were slowly building a layer of filth inside the rifle's beating heart. In a dry training range, it could be managed. In Vietnam, in waterlogged jungle, in fine silt, in constant humidity, it became a nightmare that grew teeth quickly. But the worst part wasn't the heat, or the mud, or the fact that war is never fair. The worst part was that the rifle's core reliability had been sabotaged by bureaucracy. Eugene Stoner, the designer, built something like a race car of combat rifles. Light, accurate, fast. It was engineered around a specific kind of ammunition, stick powder that burned in a way the system could tolerate. Then the Army Ordnance world, old-school gatekeepers, proud and stubborn, decided they could improve things. They swapped the powder. They moved to ball powder without properly communicating the change, without proper testing under the conditions that mattered, without treating Stoner's design like the delicate machine it was. Ball powder burned dirtier. It raised the cyclic rate. It increased fouling and heat. It made the rifle run faster, harder, hotter, like redlining an engine while dumping sand into it. It was like taking that Ferrari and filling the tank with contaminated fuel, then blaming the driver when the engine seized. And admitting the mistake would have meant admitting the suits in Washington had been wrong, so they didn't. They kept shipping rifles. Marines kept dying. The letters started arriving back home, stuffed into envelopes that smelled faintly of mildew and fear. Letters written by boys who were trying to sound brave but couldn't hide the desperation between the lines. Some begged their families for civilian cleaning supplies, brushes, solvent, patches, because the army hadn't even issued proper cleaning kits. Others wrote about being told the rifle was self-cleaning, as if a machine built to vent hot gas into itself could magically scrub itself pure. The lie wasn't just stupid, it was lethal. You can draw a straight line from that lie to a jammed chamber, from a jammed chamber to a dead Marine. By May 1967, the situation was so ugly it broke through the fog of official optimism. Representative Richard Eichort of Missouri convened a congressional investigation. The hearings that would drag the rifle's failures out into daylight. The testimony was a slow-motion detonation. Rifles lacked chrome-plated chambers, meaning humid jungle air could corrode them fast. Corrosion meant extraction problems. Extraction problems meant stuck cases. Stuck cases meant a soldier hammering a cleaning rod down a barrel while bullets cracked overhead. Ammunition was mismatched to the weapon's needs, and officials had known there were problems for months, while rifles continued to arrive in theater. And one letter, read into testimony, hit like a punch. The weapon had failed at crucial moments. In one firefight, a majority of the rifles jammed. Marines died within 10 feet of the enemy with jammed rifles in their hands. 10 feet. Let that distance sit in your mind. 10 feet isn't a battlefield, it's a room. At 10 feet, war is not strategy, it's reflex. It's terror, it's a muzzle flash right in your face. And at 10 feet, a jam isn't an inconvenience, it's a sentence. The congressional report used language that sounded less like policy and more like indictment. It described continued use of ball powder ammunition as bordering on criminal negligence. Negligence, not mere incompetence. A word that implies someone should be held responsible, but nobody went to prison. Nobody lost a pension. The men who signed off on the decisions retired into quiet lives with plaques and benefits. Procurement officers walked away. The ordnance brass avoided consequences. And out in the jungle, Americans kept dying while the enemy carried a rifle that, in the one metric that mattered, simply performed better. Which brings us back to the AK-47. Mikhail Kalashnikov wasn't a polished engineer in a lab coat selling PowerPoint slides. He was a Soviet tank commander who got blown apart in 1941 and spent months in a hospital bed listening to wounded men complain about their weapons. And while he lay there, he decided to build something different. Not a precision instrument, not a technological trophy, a tool, a rifle that a barely educated farm boy could learn quickly, a rifle that could be dropped, abused, neglected, and still fire when the moment came. A rifle that would keep working when human hands were shaking, when maintenance was impossible, when the environment was actively trying to kill the machine. Kalashnikov understood something the Pentagon forgot. In a real fight, reliability is not a feature, it is survival. The AK-47 is, in a sense, a collection of forgiving clearances and brute strength. Western engineers call that loose tolerances, like it's an insult. In the jungle, loose tolerances means mud can live in there and the bolt will still slam shut. If the M16 was a Swiss watch, the AK was a tractor. Not elegant, not refined, but eager to run no matter what you pour into the field. You could drop jungle silt into an AK receiver and it would grind through it. You could drag it through a river and it would cough once and keep going. The rifle was overgassed, overbuilt, and designed like it expected abuse. The heavy bolt carrier moved with enough force to rip spent casings free even from filthy chambers. The chrome-lined bore resisted corrosion. The tapered 7.62 2x39 cartridge extracted with a stubbornness that embarrassed more delicate systems. And the sound, veterans never forget the sound. The M16 had a sharper crack, a lighter report. The AK had a deeper mechanical clatter layered under the blast, like metal doors slamming in rhythm. A harsh, confident cadence that carried through foliage. American troops learned to recognize it the way prey recognizes a predator's call. In elephant grass, that sound meant contact was seconds away. At night, the traces were different too. Many Americans remember enemy tracer fire as an eerie green arcing out of darkness, while friendly traces cut red through the night. Those green lines weren't just bullets, they were a kind of nightmare handwriting across the sky. And by 1967, there were millions of AKs moving down supply routes into Southeast Asia. North Vietnamese regulars and Viet Cong main force units carried them in increasing numbers. When Americans met them at scale, early on in hard fights like Ia Drang, they realized the imbalance wasn't just philosophical, it was practical. The AK had a 30-round magazine. Early M16s often carried 20. The AK's cyclic rate was controllable enough to be useful in short bursts. The M14 kicked like a mule and was miserable to manage on full auto. And most importantly, in the conditions that mattered, the AK ran. A former infantryman once put it bluntly, "In a firefight, you don't don't win by looking modern. You win by gaining fire superiority. If their rifles work every time and yours don't, that superiority evaporates. But the most devastating impact wasn't just ballistic, it was psychological. Because it isn't only the jam itself that kills you, it's the doubt. It's the knowledge, buried somewhere behind your heartbeat, that your rifle might betray you when you need it most. That knowledge changes how you fight. It changes how you move. It changes how aggressive you are. It changes whether you trust your own hands, and it gets men killed. Want to know how badly the M16's early reputation collapsed? American soldiers started throwing them away, not in tantrums, not as war trophies, as a calculation. They began arming themselves with captured AK-47s. By 1967, in certain units, special operations, deep reconnaissance teams, infantry pushing into the thickest, ugliest terrain, captured Kalashnikovs were more than souvenirs. They were lifelines. The reasons were brutally simple. First, the AK worked. You could neglect it, abuse it, forget about it, and it would still fire. The early M16 demanded a level of cleanliness that bordered on absurd in a place where everything was wet, dirty, and alive. Second, ammunition. If you're running recon in Laos or Cambodia, resupply is never guaranteed. Helicopters are weather, politics, timing, enemy fire, pure uncertainty. But enemy ammunition, that was everywhere. Caches, villages, dead NVA soldiers. With a captured AK, you could keep fighting off what the jungle provided. Third, and this one sounds like something stolen from a spy novel, sound itself became a tactic. Some reconnaissance teams discovered that firing AKs during contact could buy precious seconds. In the chaos of close-range ambushes, the enemy might hear that familiar mechanical clatter and hesitate, half a heartbeat of confusion, thinking they were hearing their own men. In a jungle fight, a 3-second pause can be the difference between slipping away and being wiped out. Veterans describe it in the simplest terms. When you're facing an enemy where every rifle works and yours might not, you fight differently. You don't just fear the enemy, you fear your own gear. There were stories of Green Berets showing up to infantry lines carrying AKs and pistols like they were from another world. To the grunts, it was both terrifying and oddly reassuring, proof that even elite units made the same cold choice: carry what works. The demand got so widespread that by 1970, General Creighton Abrams issued orders requiring captured enemy weapons to be turned into headquarters, except for certain specialized reconnaissance units. Translation: even the top brass knew the truth. For some missions, the enemy's rifle made more sense than ours. American logistics units began refurbishing captured AKs, fabricating magazines, and in some cases supplying sanitized ammunition for covert operations. Navy SEAL teams documented holding large stocks of enemy rounds for their own use. Think about what that means. The most technologically advanced military on Earth was quietly maintaining supply chains for enemy weapons because its own rifle couldn't be fully trusted. Then came battles like Daido in April 1968. Close quarters, brutal, chaotic. A Marine officer later described starting with over 100 men and ending with a fraction left standing. In the aftermath, survivors carried captured AKs like insurance policies, not because it was cool, because they had watched their issued rifles fail when death was inside arm's reach. And the North Vietnamese weren't idiots. They understood they couldn't outmatch American artillery, air power, or fire support. They couldn't call in gunships. They couldn't erase grid squares with steel rain, so they developed doctrine that attacked the one place American advantage didn't matter: distance. They called it hugging the enemy, grabbing the belt buckle, closing so fast and so close that American commanders couldn't use big firepower without risking their own men. Get within 50 meters in thick terrain and suddenly the war becomes simple: rifle against rifle. At 50 meters, the AK's lack of long-range finesse doesn't matter. What matters is volume of fire and certainty. What matters is that when you squeeze the trigger, the rifle answers you. Captured enemy documents, translated by US intelligence, revealed disciplined tactics, small maneuver elements, flanking, suppressive fire, controlled bursts. It wasn't Hollywood spray and pray. It was professional soldiers exploiting weak points in American equipment. And in urban fights, like the savage house-to-house combat during the Tet Offensive in Hue, another difference emerged. The AK's heavier round could punch through interior walls, furniture, and light masonry in ways the small 5.56 sometimes didn't. Enemy soldiers could fire through barriers at shapes they couldn't see. Marines sometimes had to expose themselves to get clean shots. Add that to the soundtrack of AK fire echoing in narrow streets and concrete rooms, and you get what veterans describe as a physical reaction. That involuntary clench in your gut when you hear that cadence nearby. Not because the AK was magical, because it represented something terrifyingly practical. The other guy's rifle is more likely to fire than yours. Eventually, the M16 crisis did not last forever. By late 1967, the worst problems started being addressed. Chrome-plated chambers and bores reduced corrosion and extraction issues. Improvements to ammunition reduced fouling. The forward assist appeared. Cleaning kits were issued. Training changed from self-cleaning fantasy to hard maintenance reality. The M16A1 became a much better weapon. Men who entered combat in 1968 and later often carried a rifle that behaved differently than the early versions that haunted 1965 to 1967. The platform matured. Over decades, refinement turned it into one of the most widely used military rifles in history. Variants spread. The system became reliable in ways the earliest rifles simply weren't. But here's the thing about trust. Once you lose it, you don't get it back with a memo. An entire generation of combat veterans never fully forgave that rifle's early betrayal. Even years later, some described a visceral suspicion of the platform, not because they didn't understand the later improvements, but because memory doesn't operate on spec sheets. Memory operates on moments, on the sound of a click when there should have been a bang, on the image of a friend dead with a rifle in pieces beside him. Meanwhile, the AK's reputation grew into legend. Stories spread, some true, some inflated, about rifles buried for years that still fired, rifles dropped into rivers and recovered months later, still operational. Myth fused with reality, but the core truth remained. The AK worked under conditions that would choke most other rifles. Was it perfect? No. The sights were crude. Ergonomics were awkward by Western standards. Accuracy past a few hundred meters wasn't great. It wasn't refined. But in Vietnam, where most fights happened inside 150 meters, where humidity ate metal and mud found every seam, those limitations mattered less than one brutal advantage. It kept firing. Hackworth later wrote about the M16 crisis with the anger of someone who had watched young men pay for bureaucratic arrogance. He didn't dress it up. He essentially said what that bulldozer moment already proved. American soldiers deserved a rifle that would function without needing to be hospital clean. And coming from one of the war's most decorated infantry officers, that wasn't a casual complaint. It was an accusation. The bureaucrats who pushed the early rifle, who changed critical variables without proper testing, who ignored warnings while men died, most of them faced nothing resembling justice. Some even received credit for contributions. The troops who carried those rifles, some came home in body bags, killed in the seconds it takes to clear a stuck case. Others came home alive but burdened with a different wound. The knowledge that their own system had failed them, that the enemy's basic tool was sometimes superior to America's shiny promise. That knowledge feels like betrayal because it is. The Vietnam War ended in 1975. The M16 family became deeply embedded in U.S. military history. Years of refinement made it a genuinely capable, reliable weapon. The U.S. military never adopted the AK-47 for countless practical and political reasons. But ask a man who fought in the worst window, 1966-1967, what he would have wanted to carry when the jungle closed in and the tracers started drawing lines through the night, and the answer you'll hear again and again isn't about patriotism or aesthetics, it's about survival. The AK-47 didn't win Vietnam. Wars aren't decided by one rifle. Policy, strategy, political will, those shape the big outcome. But in the tight, wet, personal geometry of jungle combat, where a firefight is measured in meters and heartbeats, the rifle that works matters more than any grand plan. Eugene Stoner kept designing, refining, building. The men who changed the powder without proper care never offered him the apology he deserved. The people who should have been held accountable never truly admitted what happened, and the AK's reputation endured for one simple reason that doesn't require propaganda. When men's lives depended on it, it fired. That mechanical clatter in the trees, those green arcs cutting the dark, the surreal sight of Americans carrying enemy rifles because they trusted them more than their own. Those memories hardened into legend because they were born from the most unforgiving test in the world. Did it work when it mattered? In that Vietnamese construction zone, in Hackworth's hands, the answer was loud and immediate. Yes, every single time.